The silence of the Mojave is not a peaceful one. It is a predatory, suffocating weight that settles into the lungs like fine alkali dust. In the late weeks of 1849, a small, weary caravan of pioneers, men, women, and children, found themselves standing at the edge of a geographic abyss. They were staring into a basin that seemed to drop away from the very surface of the earth, a salt-crusted furnace that the world would later come to know as Death Valley. But for the Bennett and Arcane families, it was simply the end of a map that had already lied to them too many times. Historical records from this era show that the California gold rush was fueled as much by misinformation as it was by greed. These were not seasoned explorers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and tailors, lured by the Larkin guide and the promise of a cutoff that would shave weeks off their journey. They were seeking the old Spanish trail, but through a series of navigational errors and a fatal reliance on a hand-drawn map provided by a stranger, they had stepped into a topographical trap. The harsh reality of the mid-19th century meant that a single degree of error on a compass or one missed landmark was not just a delay, it was a death sentence. The heat was an invisible physical force. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of the overland trail. These pioneers traveled with heavy wooden wagons, slow-moving oxen, and iron-bound chests filled with the remnants of their previous lives. By the time they reached the valley floor, the wood of their wagons was shrinking in the intense dryness until the iron tires began to slip off the wheels. The water barrels were dry. The oxen, the very engines of their survival, were stumbling, their tongues swollen and blackened by the lack of moisture. William Lewis Manley, the young man whose journals would later preserve this nightmare, looked at the faces of the children and saw the hollow-eyed stare of the dying. The threshold they had crossed was more than just a line on a map. It was the boundary between the civilized hope of the East and the primordial indifference of the Great Basin. There was no more forward in the traditional sense. Behind them lay a desert they could not recross. Ahead of them lay a salt pan that looked like a frozen white sea, shimmering with mirages of water that vanished as they approached. The psychological weight of this realization is almost impossible to overstate. In modern times, we view the desert through the glass of an air-conditioned vehicle. But for the 49ers, the desert was a tactile, aggressive enemy. The ground beneath their feet was a crust of borax and salt that cut through leather boots. The sun was a relentless interrogator. As they descended deeper into the sink, hundreds of feet below sea level, the air grew denser, hotter, and more stagnant. They were no longer travelers. They were prisoners of the terrain. Geographically, they were trapped in a graben, a collapsed block of the Earth's crust flanked by the towering Panamint Range to the west and the Amargosa Range to the east. To the pioneers, these mountains weren't geological wonders, they were walls. The shortcut had led them into a cul-de-sac of fire. The moment they realized the mountains were impassable for their wagons was the moment the dream of gold died, replaced by the singular primal instinct to draw one more breath. They had reached the threshold where the price of survival would be the total destruction of everything they owned. They had to make a choice that defied every instinct of a pioneer, to stop moving and wait for a miracle, or to destroy their only means of transport in a desperate bid to save their lives. The wagons, which had been their homes for months, were now nothing more than firewood. The oxen, which had been their companions and laborers, were now nothing more than meat. This was the threshold of the devil's playground, a place where the rules of the world they knew no longer applied, and where the only currency left was the will to endure the unendurable. The wagon was more than a vehicle. It was a mobile sanctuary of Victorian civilization thrust into a prehistoric void. To understand the gravity of what the Bennett-Arcane party faced, we must examine the history of the everyday, the material reality of a 19th century pioneer. Each wagon was a meticulously packed archive of a family's entire existence. There were heirloom quilts stitched by grandmothers in the cool humidity of the East, heavy cast-iron Dutch ovens, mahogany chests filled with Sunday clothes, and the essential tools of a future life. plowshares, bags of seed grain, and blacksmithing hammers. These were not just possessions, they were the physical manifestation of their hope for a new beginning in California. As the heat of the salt pan intensified, reaching levels that historical climate data suggests were punishing even in the winter months of this rain-shadowed desert, the utility of these objects vanished. The desert has a way of stripping a human being down to the biological minimum. The air in the basin was so devoid of moisture that the very wood of the wagons began to weep its last resins. The hickory and oak spokes of the wheels, seasoned for years in the Missouri dampness, shrank until they rattled like bone in their iron sockets. The sound of a wagon moving across the salt crust was a cacophonous screech, a dying machine in a dying landscape. The daily routine became a ritual of survival. Historical records from this era show that the pioneers were forced to adopt methods of water extraction that bordered on the alchemical. They dug shallow wells into the alkali flats, only to find water so bitter with salt and minerals that it induced violent illness. The archive of life was being deleted, one item at a time. To lighten the load for the failing oxen, they began to jettison the heavy treasures of their past. First went the furniture, then the books, then the heavy iron tools. The desert floor became a trail of discarded history, a museum of lost ambitions. The most intimate archive, however, was the oxen themselves. These animals were the lifeblood of the migration. An ox is a creature of immense stoicism, but the Death Valley heat is an equalizer of all biology. Their hooves were cracking on the sharp salt crystals, and their hides were caked in a grey, caustic dust that burned their skin. When the party finally realized they could no longer pull the wagons over the looming Panamint Range, the decision was made. The oxen would transition from the engines of their journey to the fuel for their final gamble. This was the moment of the great burn. To preserve the meat of the slaughtered oxen, they needed fire to dry it into jerky, the only portable protein that could sustain them on a foot journey across the mountains. But in this scorched basin, there was no timber. The only wood for hundreds of miles was the very wagons they had lived in for half a year. They dismantled the hand-painted sideboards, the sturdy axles, and the cherished storage trunks. They built fires of seasoned hardwood that burned with a fierce, ironic intensity in the desert night. The scent of roasting ox meat mixed with the smell of burning hickory and the metallic tang of the salt flats. As they sat around these fires, they were burning their past to buy a few more days of a precarious future. They used the wagon covers, the heavy canvas that had shielded them from rain and wind, to fashion crude knapsacks and water bladders. The craftsmanship of the 1840s was being repurposed for a desperate exodus. They were no longer the 49ers, they were ghosts inhabiting a graveyard of their own making. The silence that followed the fires was the most terrifying archive of all. Without the lowing of the cattle or the creak of the wagons, the pioneers were left with only the sound of the wind whipping through the greasewood and the pounding of their own dehydrated hearts. They were standing in a landscape that had no memory of man, surrounded by the charred remains of the only world they knew. The tools were gone, the transport was gone. All that remained was the raw human spirit, stripped of its archive, facing an indifferent horizon. As the wagons turned to ash, a different kind of silence settled over the Bennett-Arcane party, the silence of the profound geographical void. In the mid-19th century, to be lost was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a total severance from the human collective. To understand the psychological state of these pioneers, we must recognize that they were navigating a world without a safety net. There were no radios, no aerial rescues, and no maps that could account for the shimmering, deceptive horizons of the Basin and Range province. They were effectively on another planet, and the realization of this isolation began to erode the mental fortitude of even the strongest among them. The impact of isolation on the human psyche in such an extreme environment is a documented phenomenon. In the vastness of the desert, the scale of the landscape dwarfs the individual to the point of insignificance. The Panamint Mountains loomed over them like the walls of a Titan's prison, casting long, cold shadows that contrasted sharply with the blistering heat of the day. This creates a sensory dissonance. The pioneers reported a sense of spatial vertigo, a feeling that no matter how far they walked, the mountains never drew closer. The lack of landmarks and the crystalline clarity of the desert air distorted their perception of distance, leading to a crushing sense of futility. The social fabric of the group began to strain under the weight of this isolation. In the 1840s, the concept of the rugged individual was a necessity, but human beings are inherently communal. As water supplies dwindled to mere drops, the communal spirit was tested by the primal urge for self-preservation. Historical accounts from William Lewis Manley describe the harrowing sound of children crying for water, a sound that tore at the sanity of the parents who had led them into this trap. The silence of the desert was often broken by these visceral reminders of their failure as protectors. Furthermore, the pioneers were suffering from the early stages of heat exhaustion and clinical dehydration, which manifest not just as physical thirst, but as profound mental confusion and irritability. The brain, deprived of fluid, struggles to maintain the veneer of Victorian decorum. Men who had been neighbors for years began to look at one another with suspicion. The isolation was not just geographic, it was becoming internal. Each person was trapped within the scorching confines of their own failing body, wondering if they would be the first to fall and if the others would have the strength or the mercy to bury them. There is a specific type of despair that comes from the weight. Because they did not know the way out, they were forced to send scouts, Manley and John Rogers, ahead to find a route to a mission or a settlement. For those left behind in the long camp, time became a stagnant pool. They spent weeks huddled under the shade of their remaining canvas, watching the sun track across a sky that refused to yield a single cloud. This forced passivity is often more psychologically damaging than the struggle of movement. It allowed the mind to dwell on the what-ifs, the decisions at the junction, the warnings ignored, and the faces of loved ones they would likely never see again. This isolation was compounded by the alkali shadow. The ground they sat upon was toxic, the dust they breathed was caustic. They were physically being consumed by the environment they were trying to escape. In the 1850s, the psychological understanding of trauma didn't exist in the medical lexicon, but the symptoms were there: the thousand-yard stare, the lethargy of spirit, and the surrender to fate. They were witnessing the slow-motion collapse of their own lives. In this silence, the desert whispered a terrifying truth, that the earth did not care if they lived or died. The devil's playground was not evil, it was simply indifferent, and that indifference was the heaviest burden of all. The breaking point of the human spirit is rarely a sudden snap. It is a slow, agonizing erosion until only the rawest nerves remain. For the Bennett and Arcane families, stranded in the long camp, while Manley and Rogers sought a passage to civilization, the climax of their ordeal was reached when the last of the oxen were slaughtered. They had reached the absolute end of their resources. The silence of the valley floor was now punctuated only by the dry, rasping breaths of children whose skin had turned the color of the parchment maps that had betrayed them. Historical data regarding the physiological effects of extreme dehydration, especially in an environment where temperatures could swing from blistering daytime highs to freezing desert nights, paints a gruesome picture. The blood thickens, the heart labors to pump a sludge-like fluid through narrowing veins, and the mind begins to fracture. For the parents in that camp, the breaking point was not their own pain, but the sight of their children's eyes sinking into their skulls. They were witnessing the extinction of their lineage in a nameless basin. Then, a flicker of movement appeared on the shimmering horizon. It was Manley and Rogers, returning after an absence so long, the camp had already begun to mourn them. They did not return with a rescue party or a fleet of wagons. They returned on foot, bringing only a small amount of food and the grim news that the way out was a brutal mountainous trek that would require them to abandon everything, literally everything, but the clothes on their backs. This was the moment of ultimate sacrifice. To stay was to die. To move was to risk a more agonizing end on the jagged ridges of the Panamint Range. The scene that followed was one of primal desperation. The pioneers gathered what little strength they had left. They took the heavy, ornate clothing they had packed for their new lives in California and tore it into strips to wrap the bleeding feet of the remaining animals and themselves. They abandoned the last of their family Bibles, their silver, and the heavy tools of their trades. In a final act of ritualistic survival, they turned their backs on the charred circles of their burned wagons, the archives of their former lives, and began the ascent. The climb out of the valley was a vertical nightmare. They had to haul themselves and their surviving children up canyons of crumbling rock and over ridges that seemed to lead only to more mountains. At one point they encountered a precipice so steep that the remaining oxen could not descend. In a display of 19th century ingenuity born of absolute necessity, they used their last ropes to lower the terrified animals over a shelf of rock, one by one. The physical exertion in their malnourished state was a defiance of biological limits. The climax of this journey occurred as they reached the final crest of the mountains. Exhausted, weeping, and physically shattered, they turned back for one last look at the white, shimmering expanse that had nearly been their tomb. It was in this moment of raw, unshielded emotion that one of the men, records suggest it was either Asabel Bennett or one of the Arcanes, looked down at the desolate salt pan and uttered the words that would burn themselves into the geography of the American West. Goodbye, Death Valley. In that sentence, the location was finally christened. It was not a name chosen by a cartographer or a king. It was a curse spat out by a survivor. They had broken the valley's hold, but at a cost that could never be repaid. They were leaving behind their wealth, their history, and a part of their sanity, stepping forward as beggars into a land they had once hoped to conquer. The breaking point had passed, and what emerged on the other side were not the same people who had entered the shortcut months before. They were hardened remnants, shaped by the furnace, carrying the weight of a name that would haunt the map forever. The dust of the Panamint Range eventually settled, but the historical aftermath of the Bennett-Arcane party was not marked by a grand welcome. When the survivors finally staggered into the fertile valleys of California, they did not look like the pioneers of legend. They were skeletal figures, their skin tanned to the consistency of old leather, their eyes harboring a vacant, haunted quality that modern psychologists would recognize as the hallmark of profound trauma. Historical records from the 1850s indicate that while they had reached the land of gold, the wealth they sought was largely irrelevant. They had traded their health, their livestock, and their family legacies just to remain among the living. To analyze the aftermath, one must look at the geographic scar left by this event. The shortcut that nearly killed them, the Hunt-Jefferson map route, was quickly struck from the itineraries of sensible travelers. However, the story of their survival began to circulate through the mining camps and coastal settlements, transforming a nameless, hostile basin into a localized legend. The name Death Valley was not officially recognized by the U.S. Geological Survey for decades, yet it persisted in the vernacular of the West, a linguistic monument to the party's suffering. The technical reality of the era meant that there was no debriefing for these survivors. Many of the families drifted apart, the shared trauma perhaps too heavy to bear in one another's company. William Lewis Manley, the hero of the trek, eventually penned his memoirs, Death Valley in '49, which remains the primary documentary source for this event. His writing reveals a man struggling to reconcile the manifest destiny of his age with the sheer, mindless brutality of the desert. He didn't write of conquest. He wrote of the shrouds of alkali and the moans of the dying. In the broader tapestry of American history, the Bennett-Arcane ordeal served as a grim corrective to the era's unbridled optimism. It highlighted the lethal gap between the industrial ambitions of the East and the unforgiving physical realities of the West. The aftermath was a lesson in humility. The desert had not been conquered. It had merely permitted a few souls to escape. The wagons they burned and the oxen they consumed became part of the valley's own history, relics that would be rediscovered by later explorers, bleached white by the sun, serving as a warning to any who dared to underestimate the Devil's Playground. The survivors moved on to build lives in the San Fernando Valley and beyond, but the Death Valley they named remained a ghost in their minds. They had seen the limits of human endurance, and in doing so, they provided the world with a harrowing data point on the price of a shortcut. The aftermath was not just a list of survivors, it was the birth of a dark American myth, where the landscape itself became the antagonist and the only victory was the act of walking away. Today, the valley that nearly swallowed the Bennett-Arcane party is a national park, a place of stark, haunting beauty visited by millions. But the legacy of those who suffered there in 1849 is not found in the gift shops or the paved overlooks. It is etched into the very silence of the salt flats. The story of the shortcut to hell remains a foundational document in the study of human resilience. It serves as a grim reminder that the history of the American West was written not just in gold and glory, but in the ash of burned wagons and the salt of desperate tears. To reflect on this journey is to understand the human geography of survival. The 49ers were not superhuman. They were ordinary people, parents, craftsmen, and dreamers who were forced to confront a reality that stripped away every layer of their civilization. Their legacy is the profound truth that when everything material is lost, when the tools are gone, the animals are dead, and the maps are proven false, the only thing that remains is the intangible bond of human loyalty. Manley and Rogers did not have to return for the families in the long camp. They could have saved themselves. Their decision to go back is the true archive of honor that defines this story. From a documentary perspective, the Bennett-Arcane party provides a rare, unfiltered look at the micro-history of the gold rush. While the history books often focus on the millions made in the mines, this story focuses on the millions of steps taken in the wrong direction. It is a tribute to the unsung pioneer, the one who didn't find the mother lode, but who found the strength to lead their family out of the shadow of death. The name Death Valley stands as a linguistic monument to that struggle, a name that commands respect for the environment and for the ghosts of those who walked across it when it was truly an unknown frontier. As we look back from our modern world of GPS and instant communication, the ordeal of the 49ers reminds us of the weight of choice. A single decision to take a shortcut changed their lives and the map of the world forever. They taught us that resilience is not the absence of fear, but the persistence through it. Their story is a testament to the fact that while the desert may be indifferent to our presence, the human spirit is anything but. They left the valley behind, but they left us a legacy of endurance that refuses to be buried by the shifting sands of time. Before we dive deeper into the archives of the past, subscribe to Wildbound History and tell us in the comments, what country and city are you watching from? Thank you for exploring the untamed past with us at Wildbound History. If you believe these stories of resilience must never be forgotten, hit the like button and subscribe for our next historical journey. Until next time, stay wild.